I'm Doug Fern, and this is my take on music recording. John O'Reilly is a studio drummer who spends most of his time in his studio recording drum tracks for clients. He talks about his experiences leading up to his business, Boom Crash Drum Tracks. Our conversation covers much more than that. We talk about his philosophy of drumming and music, the challenges and rewards of providing drum overdub tracks, and his commitment to teaching. We discuss the current state of music and the music of the past. We started off talking about John's longtime collaboration as a member of the Hazelrigg Brothers Trio. Well, we should point out that you are the drummer with the Hazelrigg Brothers Trio.
Correct.
You're on all the records they've done, including, I think, a new one that's about to come out. They do that project with you, and I'm not really involved in that, but we've done other things with them. Some of their projects, some of my projects. It's just a great combination of talent. The three of you just sound so good together.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I've been fortunate to get to play with those guys. It's funny, I lived here in Doylestown, Pennsylvania for maybe 5 years before I met them. I moved here from Los Angeles, which is where I grew up. But before Los Angeles, I moved around, and I was living in New York City for a long time, and then moved back to LA for a few years, and then moved here. And when I did, I kind of thought one of the big drawbacks of the move was that I was leaving the city, leaving Los Angeles, and kind of stepping away from what I was doing professionally there, which was was starting to become like a lot of touring, not a ton of studio work out there, but a bit. But I kind of saw the writing on the wall with like the touring thing, and was ready to like not do that. And yeah, that whole project's been really fun for me. But a big part of why that's so fun, I took like a hard step away from jazz music at a certain point in my life. I studied that stuff in college and was doing a lot of gigs, and when I lived in New York mostly, and in the jazz world. Just at a certain point, I just kind of burnt out. I was just like, I'm not into it. Like, I'm not emotionally that invested in this music. And I just want to play music that I like, which I don't know why it took me so long to figure that out. But I noticed like every time I do a jazz gig, I just get in the car and blast Bad Brains, and I was like, okay, something's wrong with this relationship I have with jazz. And so the reason I enjoy playing with them so much is, one, it allows me to kind of play in that jazzy way without playing actual, jazz standards. In addition to that, kind of taking a step into the classical world with some of the stuff that we do, and, their whole approach coming from being brought up as classical musicians. That's another thing that I've always enjoyed and haven't really had that many opportunities to do, especially, there was a lot of that going on in college. When I went to college at Arizona State University, which has a great music education department, which is kind of why I started there, but then ended up just being a jazz major. But one of the highlights of my years there was a guy named Sam Palafian, who was a tuba player. At the time, like one of the world's greatest tuba players. He was a member of the Boston Brass for a long time, and he was the tuba instructor, but he was also the big band director at the school. By way of being in that band with him, we got to be close and played a bunch together in a trio that was largely like kind of classical stuff. It was tuba, saxophone, and drums. It was a similar setup to what you've heard me do with the Hazelriggs. It's like, they have a piece of music that they'll play, not quite verbatim, but sort of, and, then maybe improvise around it. Whereas I'm just kind of making noise the whole time, right, related to what they're doing, but I'm sort of just improvising my stuff and just kind of reacting to what's happening with their largely composed parts. And that is a lot of fun. So
Yeah, well, I know. A few years ago we did that project where they did the Samuel Barber excursions, which is a wonderful piece of 20th century classical music. And it was just, well, George is playing the piano part because it's written for piano, just pretty much note for note. His phrasing may be slightly different, but it's pretty close to the original composition. Probably so close that most people wouldn't really notice a whole lot of difference. And adding the upright bass and the drums to it just adds a completely new dimension. Frankly, when they told me about that project, I was skeptical. I just kept thinking, how are you going to fit drums in this? Bass, yeah, I could kind of see that, but drums, but it worked really well. Unfortunately, that piece was never released, and I think we're going to redo it. There was talk about it.
I heard there's talk. Yeah.
So I know George.
Yeah, that's fun. I mean, well, the thing that's the talk involves, like, I don't remember what number George said, but it was at least like 6. He's like, I'm going to need at least like 6 months, to get that piece up and running again. Whereas, I just kind of listen to it a few times and then just sort of roll in. There's very, very little. I have, my contribution to that music is a lot different than his. But yeah, I mean, that's a cool headspace to be in. I think it's unique, and it's, like I said, it's something that I've only really had a chance to do a few times, of like, treating the drum set as a classical instrument rather than a rock or jazz. You're just kind of approaching it a little bit differently. Now, I mean with those guys, I think sort of the idea is that we're bringing some of those elements of rock and jazz into that music, but the mindset, I feel, is way different. Those sessions that we did, what was it? We did like 2 days there, or was it just 1 day, 2 days?
No, it was 2 days, and I think it was actually 3. I think we spent 1 day just experimenting with a room.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But man, I was exhausted after those 2 days of recording that music. Because the piece wasn't very long. It's like maybe 10 minutes end to end, 15. Maybe not even.
Yeah,
and
I think it's a little longer than that, but it's not long at all.
But a lot happens. I mean, that's the difference. It's like when you're, I guess you could argue the same for jazz as compared to what I'm doing normally, which is rock music. There's a lot more thinking involved. There's so much more happens in a short amount of time than what happens in a traditional pop song.
Right.
For sure.
Well, it's definitely not verse, chorus, bridge.
Right.
Kind of structure. Totally. It's totally different.
Right.
Well, speaking of, your day-to-day playing, how long have you been doing that? I know you have Boom Crash, which you seem really busy with that, so that's wonderful. But explain the history of that and talk about what you do.
So basically what it is that I do is I have this Boom Crash drum tracks is what I call it. It's at boomcrashdrumtracks.com. But it's what I call a remote recording service. So the whole idea is that I'm here with my studio and people send me tracks to play on, and I record here and then send the files to, wherever they're going. And it's, the end result is what you would get in a traditional recording environment, but it all just sort of happens remotely. And how that happens remotely, varies depending on the project, but largely I'm pretty autonomous. I mean, people send me music that they need me to record to, which, like I said, is largely kind of pop rock stuff, singer-songwritery things. And, it varies quite a bit, but the gist of it is I, get the music to record to. We talk about what we want the drums to do. I record one or a few takes, send MP3s out for evaluation, and then we just kind of, tweak until the end product is what we want. And then I send the files out, and that's about it. And, this started about 10 years ago, I think I really started to dig into it. It was not long after we moved to Doylestown, and I had been thinking about doing this for a while, but, amassing the gear needed for, recording a drum set isn't a small feat. So I was, just starting to kind of collect microphones and stuff. And then I actually, at the time, was working for a music publishing company as a editor, a company called Alfred Music Publishing. So I was their drum set editor for like educational books and DVDs. And I left that job. Well, I lost that job because they laid off like half the company at a certain point. That was my opportunity. It was like, all right, now's my time to just dig in and like really get this figured out. So I found a space to do it in. I rent a space about 20 minutes from my house, and I bought all the rest of the gear that I needed and just started going for it. And, really, like, I had been in the recording world a bunch as a player, but honestly had like actively avoided really digging into the specifics of the engineering. I mean, so much so that like when I was in college, I was in a band and we had a studio that we built. We got signed to a label and got a bunch of money, and that money went largely towards building a studio that we were able to just use, to demo stuff and eventually record other bands and use it for other side projects and all kinds of stuff. But during that process, some of the other guys in the band, got really into figuring out the engineering. And I was like, I wanted no part of it. I was like, I'm happy to play drums, but I don't care about all that stuff. And the bummer is that I think that I missed many opportunities over my life to like, really pick up some useful information in how to do all this. But whatever, when the time came for me to do it myself, I was surprised by how into the engineering I actually got and really enjoyed the process of figuring it out, getting the space set up, kind of getting into treating the room so that everything sounded the way I wanted it to, and, starting to, mess around with different microphones and different, all the things that go into recording a drum set. Once I started to kind of get it figured out, that maybe took a couple years really to feel like I was really, where I needed to be. And luckily I had, plenty of projects to work on in that time, friends who had music to record and would, send me things. And, and I think once I kind of set up the website and people could start to find me just on the internet, without knowing me ahead of time, work started to come in naturally that way. But that whole process, I did feel like, took quite a while. But at a certain point, I think it was, I changed the website. I kind of like put up a video, sort of explaining the process. And, so this was it was around 2010, 2011. And even then, I mean, it was only 10 years ago, but like it was still not the status quo. Like now I feel like, especially because of COVID, everyone has a studio at home, and the thing is that it used to be that a lot of people have studios at home, but except drummers, right? Because it takes so much to record the drums. You need, so many channels, and you need a space to do it in, and you need to be able to make noise. So a lot of my work, and this continues now, comes from people who can pretty much do everything else themselves, but other than the drums, right? So like a singer-songwriter who can play guitar and bass and sing, keyboards, and can kind of cobble together everything. And, maybe starts out using canned drums, using, whatever samples or loop packs or whatever, and realize at a certain point that that's not going to cut it. I think most people realize that it's not going to, they're going to need to put real drums on it at some point, but maybe are hopeful that they can get away with not doing that. And then at a certain point realize that it's the AI drummer is not really cutting it. So they'll send things my way, and then I, am able to do my thing. But the number of drummers that at the time when I started doing this, had studios to do that in were not very many. So I think that I I kind of got in at just the right time, to like sort of capitalize upon the fact that not many people were doing it. And those that were doing it, were maybe doing it a little bit subpar in terms of equipment or the space that they're recording in or whatever. I made an effort from the get-go to kind of make it be as professional as possible in terms of, the sound. So yeah, I mean, really since then it's been like, I've been busy. Every month I'm shocked that like I'm still able to do this and like make a living doing it. It's really great. And so, I mean, I think that it's, snowballed over the years to, include a lot of producer types who just have gotten used to this sort of workflow and know that I exist. And if it's a project that they can get away with doing sort of remotely, they'll send it my way. Or, a lot of times it's, the demo process happens with me doing drums remotely with the idea that, we'll get together in person at some point. There are lots of composer types that end up taking advantage of this because, those guys who are like doing music for commercials or, I don't do a lot of like movie soundtrack stuff, but, like little documentaries or whatever, like kind of smaller project composer things. It seems like those guys are always on a crazy deadline. And so being able to say like, dude, I need drums tomorrow, being able to provide that for people, I think has been a big reason why this has, remained lucrative. So it's great.
It's one of those things that our modern technology's made practical. I mean, back in the days, tape, that would totally be impossible. You'd have to have the person in there.
Yeah, right.
So it certainly changed our whole approach to it. But I'm curious, if you get something in from a singer-songwriter who's, not necessarily totally experienced, they've been doing it for a few years, but they still have a lot to learn. Is that a challenge to you to follow their changes in tempo and, and the idiosyncratic kinds of things they do in the song that, normally in a you'd work that out with a drummer before you started recording.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think that in general, I think that people are pretty aware of how the process goes down. Now, maybe I've just been lucky, but I'm thinking back on like, projects that have been difficult in that regard. And there definitely have been some. So a good example is, someone who has some sort of demo down. I mean, I say demo. Sometimes it's, they think that this is the finished product and they want to add drums to it. And I listen to it and I think, okay, sounds great. And then I come to realize that, well, they didn't record to a click, even though it sounds like their time is pretty good. But as soon as you start to play along with that, it's like, you realize pretty quickly that like, oh, okay, I see they did not do this with a steady tempo behind them. So that's of all the challenges, that's one of the greatest ones, is learning how to sort of deal with that. Now, I also see it as a challenge that I enjoy tackling. So I've been able to work around those things. And as long as, it's not like way, way out of whack, it usually ends up being fine. But I think that when you're dealing with someone who really doesn't know how the process normally works, like who, hasn't been around the recording world, or this is, one of their first times doing it or whatever, those challenges are usually, pretty quickly overcome. But there have been a few instances where like I've had to kind of help. So, so then my role ends up being combination drummer and producer. It's what would have happened if, if the singer-songwriter had gone into a studio and said, I want to record this song and I want to add drums to it. Well, the engineer producer would have said, okay, great. Let's put on a metronome and get it down to the metronome, and then we'll bring a drummer in, or, let's bring a drummer in and you guys can record it together, or however that would have gone down. I end up having to kind of retrofit, things to that model. And the ways that I've dealt with it have, if something is like, kind of close to a steady tempo, but not really quite there, I'll, say, listen, I think that it's going to be a lot better in the end if I record drums to a click, you re-record your stuff to my drums, and then kind of take it from there. And so I'll take whatever file they've sent me with their demo and sort of just cut it up so that it adheres to some steady tempo, and then kind of start scratch from there. And I've, the fact of the matter is I've gotten really used to recording to a click and not to whatever it is that I'm playing along with. And it's funny because it's something that have thought a lot about recently, just thinking about this whole, I mean, better than anybody because you've been around this recording industry for so long. It's weird to be to be making music this way, to be by myself in this studio, recording with nobody else around. It's a very strange way to make music. But I'm aware of that, and I've thought a lot about how the process is different when you're in a traditional recording environment versus what I'm doing here. So, if I'm doing a singer-songwriter session in a traditional environment, you've got the artist, and then you have a band assembled, and you're all playing together, but you're still playing with a click track. At least, most of the stuff that I do, you're still playing with a click, and certainly it's more fun recording that way, because you're with other human beings, and there might be some ideas that are bounced around that, wouldn't be bounced around when you're sort of in a vacuum like I am here. But there's not a lot in a pop rock world. This is obviously different if it's anything remotely jazzy or, any music that's largely improvisational. But in a pop rock world, in those sessions, I'm still just like paying attention to the click more than I am anything else, to just lay that solid foundation, knowing full well that things might get scrapped, so, if I'm recording with a bass player and guitars and keyboards and a singer, any one of those things can be replaced relatively easily. But the attitude is that when we're tracking all together, the drums are going to be keepers. That's sort of the goal. Because of that, I'm extra aware of where the click is. And sure, maybe in that setting, there's a little bit more flexibility with kind of, depending on whether other people are listening to the click or not, kind of skewing the where the time is in relation to the click is a little bit easier to do than when I'm here by myself. But really the attitude is pretty much the same. I wonder, I don't know if everyone has the same experience, if it's because I've done plenty of recording in person, I think there are probably a lot of drummers out there, younger people. This is their relationship with music is going to be largely from home, recording by themselves, and maybe not playing with a lot of people in person. And how does that affect the music? Is their attitude different somehow? I'm not really sure.
First of all, I have a confession to make. In I can't even tell you how many years, but 50 some years of recording, I've never recorded with a click track.
Awesome.
Never once.
Oh, that's great. I love that. I love it.
And I intend to finish my career without ever breaking that rule.
That's awesome.
Yeah, because I just like having the drummer be the click track on the session.
Of course.
And, that's the way music's supposed to, which is a totally different thing than what you're doing, It's like when we've done projects together, we've never used a click. We've always, though, had a sort of count in with a metronome, so we always know that every take's going to be at the same tempo.
Totally.
But, we do a measure or two of that click and then shut it off.
Right. Which is obviously a lot different than actually playing along with it. But that's really interesting. I mean, I wish that there were more sessions in my, experience that were not done to a click. I mean, the sessions that I've done, like I love it when I've been in sessions and we've been recording to a click and we decide to not, that's getting in the way. To like turn it off and then record without it. That always feels so great. I mean, it's like, to me, it's like, the feeling of like, going down the big drop on a roller coaster. It's like so exciting to not have that, to not have to be dealing with that click. I mean, I've done it so much that it's almost gone the opposite direction for me recently, where like I do so much recording with a click that, it's a little bit scary actually. It's also similar to the roller coaster metaphor, but I'm, not having that safety net of the click is a little bit terrifying sometimes. Like one of my big things when I'm recording drums is I don't plan out like drum fills. So like I know what the feel is going to be and I know what the form is, and I kind of have an idea of, like, okay, I'm going to be on the hi-hat for the verses and I'll go to a open hi-hat for the choruses or whatever. But I'm not planning out what the fills are going to be. And for me, that's what keeps it sort of in that zone of like discovery and, a little bit of improvisation, which I think keeps it sounding exciting and, keeps me engaged mentally. Being in that zone where you're really, creating stuff that is unexpected is something that I wish could happen more in my life. That's a big thing of what's changed in recorded music.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true. I mean, if you listen to like any Motown song, it starts at one tempo and ends at another.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
Totally. And it works perfectly, because there was a bunch
you never really think much of it
Yeah.
until you start to scrutinize it. Yeah.
Right. We have new technology that allows us to approach it a different way. And although it's still not comfortable for me to do things that way, I certainly see the value of it.
Right.
Especially if you're doing, like dance music or something where it's got to be a constant tempo.
Yeah, totally. I worry about the state of, recorded music especially. I think that is something that is, changing, not necessarily for the better.
Yeah, we've allowed, for a lot of people anyway, I'm even subject to this too, as much as I try to resist it, but we've allowed the technology to sort of drive the music rather than the other way around. And although I don't want to go back to the days of tape. I really don't.
Right.
I love recording in digital, but I try not to let the technology affect too much how I'm working with the music, as a producer, trying to make the technology, first of all, transparent to the performers.
Right.
And then, minimal influence on me.
Right, totally.
It's always been the case that new technology has offered us new ways to do things.
Sure, totally.
Every step of the way, from the earliest recording to what we have today. For the most part, that progress has been in a positive direction. I tend to agree with you that I'm a little concerned about the direction music's going, just because, we're too enamored of the technology right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I tend to look at it, two ways. It's like with regards to like the recording process, like the actual, act of recording music. You've got the fly by the seat of your pants method of just sort of throwing a bunch of people in a room and going for it. And then you have, the piecing it together one by one and really, scrutinizing each piece of the puzzle. It's, for me, it's one of two ways. I get either a song that's completely bare, just like a guitar and a voice, and the idea is to replace everything once the drums are done. That's great because it provides me with freedom to, change little things about the feel or even with the arrangement or whatever when I'm recording, knowing that nothing is set in stone yet. And then the other end of the spectrum is it's been completely done. And, for whatever reason, the drums that they have are not cutting it. And so I swoop in and, I'm kind of the pixie dust that gets thrown on it with the acoustic drums. And, and that's exciting in its own way too. But the attitude towards making music in those two different ways, it's kind of letting things evolve organically versus almost too much in control of what is happening, right? I don't know. I mean, I think about how classical composers, dealt with their music back when there was no way to record it. There was no way for them to like really have a sense of how things are going to sound outside of their mind until they, were in front of an orchestra and actually playing the music. I feel like it could almost, we're almost more in that direction right now in terms of having everything so dialed in the planning stages of recording the music so that the end product is fully realized and a very concise statement versus something that is sort of improvised and is a little bit sporadic. You know what I mean? It'll be interesting to see where things go. I mean, I think you're right. With certain types of music, obviously there's been a lot of great stuff that's come out of the technology, and we've been lucky in our lives to like see that happen. I remember for me being in college and when Bjork started to be really popular and all the stuff that she was doing with computers and electronic music and kind of blending dance music with her songwriting style. And like, that was all really cool to see happen. I wonder what's going to come next. I mean, now that we've gotten through the invention of, electricity and, and synthesizers and like drum machines and then, computers and sampling and like all this stuff, like, is there going to be something else that's really cool that's going to create some different music, or is it just going to be kind of more of the same crap?
Well, if you take that to its logical conclusion, eventually you don't need humans involved in the process at all.
Yeah.
They'll write the song, do the arrangement. They won't have to record anything because it'll all be existing in the giant computer, and then mix the whole thing and crank out another song. I hope we don't come to that, but
I know. But it's crazy. I mean, a lot of that when I'm getting demos from songwriters, what people are using more than anything these days is the AI drummer in Logic. Where like you don't do anything. I actually have not used it myself, so I don't know the ins and outs. But as I understand it, you just play a song. You record into Logic your stuff, and the AI drummer just kind of figures out what to play. It's not like you're not programming anything, and then you can tweak after it. But it's amazing. I get a lot of things where it's like, oh yeah, don't pay attention too much to the drums. It was just the Logic, AI drummer, and it's like they sound pretty good. I'm going to kind of do what that drummer's doing, but hopefully make it better.
Yeah, that's kind of scary in a way, isn't it?
It is. What always ends up happening. And this is validating for me, of course, but I record the acoustic drums and send them back to the artist, and they are like, "Oh my God, I can't. It's so much better. Like, this is incredible. Thank you so much." And that always feels really great. I would say the AI drummer can get pretty close. I mean, you can get 75% of the way there, maybe. Where the sounds are happening, the feel is pretty much happening, but that extra 25% that a human being brings to it is a lot. That counts for a lot, I think. And I don't see how that will, be able to be replaced. Really
no,
ever.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it can be. You can have two takes of the same song that are superficially identical. And, you could even line them up with each other and play them both together, and they would pretty much sound the same as you went back and forth between them. But yet one has something special and the other doesn't. And
right.
So I think humans are extremely sensitive to those subtleties, even though we may not even have the vocabulary to describe them. And certainly we don't have the technology to measure them. It's something that happens in our brains. And it's, the human response to music to me, is just miraculous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, totally. Well, yeah, I mean, it's the number of, calculations that are going on in your brain when creating or listening to music. I mean, no computer is ever going to be able to I'm sure on paper they can get to this, somewhere close to the amount of processing that's going on. But yeah, I mean, there's something magical there for sure.
Right. And the other thing, and I know that you, by the nature of your work, you don't really have an input on this, is that when you bring a bunch of people into the room together and they start playing together, the sum is more than the parts. Things happen that nobody would expect. And you get this kind of feedback thing when you have good players in the room and somebody does something and they say, oh, I didn't mean to do that. And everybody says, no, that was great. Do that again.
Totally. Yeah.
And you sort of miss that when you're putting songs together piece by piece or
I know
computer bit by computer bit.
I know, totally. Well, I mean, that's the stuff that, like I was saying earlier about, that for me, the workflow is largely identical, whether I'm in a room with people or by myself. But, the fun factor is way different. And that, of course, affects the energy that you're putting out on your instrument. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But, I mean, here, the thing that I'm aware of, though, in my world that I find interesting is that, the difference between me recording here in my studio on my own versus, being in a room with people is that I have way more opportunity to edit myself. Not maybe is a good thing, maybe isn't. But I mean, I think that for me, I think partly because I'm aware of it, is largely a good thing. So it's like if I'm, tracking a song and everything's going great and, I botch a fill going into the chorus, whatever, I can stop and just keep the energy where it is because it's, it's still in the moment for me, go back 8 bars, start recording again and get, to play a fill that's better and then keep going with the song. I'm still in the same headspace versus, when you're in a traditional recording studio, you botch a fill, you just kind of roll through it and you get through the end of the song. And then, and then maybe after the fact you go and punch that fill or whatever. And then, and it's, such a insignificant little, blip of time in the course of the whole song. It's not like, any subtle change in energy for that one little bit is not going to really be noticed by anyone. But that's the one thing that I do really like about recording this way is that I can not only if I like straight up mess up and can go back and, fix it right away, but if something isn't quite right with the feel, like for instance, if it's, like I don't know, a couple of weeks ago I had to do like sort of it was like bordering on sort of jazz fusion-y stuff. And it was kind of like, 16th note heavy, right? Mm-hmm. Between the hi-hat and the snare drum. And it right at first it was, it wasn't feeling quite right. And if I were in a traditional recording environment with other people where, it's like those environments usually for me are you need to get it done as quickly as possible, right? Like time is money is sort of the attitude in some of those sessions. So my defense mechanism there is to just, simplify things a little bit and just get it into a zone where it's going to feel good and it's going to just make things work. And I think that, there's something to be said for that for sure, for like kind of playing it safe and being in that headspace of like, just make it feel good. Don't do anything crazy, just like get through the end of the song, make everyone's life easy. That attitude contributes to the magic in some ways. But when I'm here, I can, take a second and be like, oh, okay, you know what? This 16th note thing isn't quite working out. Let me just kind of work on it for a second. And I, sort of get it happening and I can sort of, tweak a bit and take the time to do that. I think the end result maybe ends up being better as a result.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense because certainly anytime any of us have an opportunity to sort of push pause on whatever activity we're doing and just spend a moment reflecting on it, we come up with new ideas, hopefully better ideas.
Totally. And right, not being encumbered by, whatever forces are at work in a traditional studio. I think that, yeah, there's something to that. The other thing, while I'm on the subject of, what makes recording this way better in some ways, is the fact that when I roll in here in the morning, I don't have to set up drums. It's amazing. That's the thing that I've noticed. The sessions that I go and do in person, it's like, crap, I have to so many studios have drum sets now. It's almost rare that I am bringing my own drums anywhere, but there's still a fair amount of gear that I'm bringing regardless, a bunch of snare drums and, all the stuff. I find that really tedious now when I've gotten so used to just kind of, I'm careful in my place I change drums out a lot. I've several drum kits that I'm switching between all the time. So it's not like I'm never having to set up drums, but.
Well, at least you don't have to carry them from the van
totally
to the venue or the studio.
Tell me about it. Yeah. Or, like sound check. This never happens with you, of course, because one, you're great and you know what you're doing, but also because you use such an organic, recording method that it's sort of not really necessary. The sound check, when in sessions with you are like, okay, just, play drums for a bit. And that's great. It's not, all right, kick drum, and then it's kick drum for 5 minutes. And then, all right, snare drum. That's the worst.
I don't
enjoy doing that.
Yeah, I always hated that. And back in the times when I had a commercial studio, we had a lot of record company business because record companies were really the source of all serious recording money. You'd have a record label that would book a month to do an album, and you'd spend the first 2 or 3 days just playing around with stuff. It was great for me to experiment, but it somehow detracted from the overall process of making music.
Yeah.
And it gave people too much to think about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. One of the first times that I was in like a real professional recording environment was in a band that I was in college. We got a, record deal or whatever and we were in Ardent Studios in Memphis, Tennessee, but whatever. It was, like big, impressive, kind of scary studio. And
but
we were in
I was in there in the 70s. So, but
okay. Yeah.
I haven't been there since.
Yeah. I think it's still there. This would have been like, early mid 90s. We were in this, this big studio and we, get all the drums set up. Yeah. It was like several days of like miking things up and getting, just kind of getting sounds and doing the whole thing. That when it came time to actually start recording, it was like, all right, now let's record. And I was like petrified. It's just like, oh my God, there's so much has gone into this already. Like, I better not screw this up. I better play well. I remember there being actually one song on that album, which is like an album that never came out. It was one of those things where like the band was dropped eventually from the label, like because our A&R guy was fired or whatever. I remember there being a song on that album that we recorded at Ardent, and then we chose kind of the demo version to use. And it was supposed to be like the single for the album, but the demo version was just better. Just like it was just had a cooler vibe. It didn't necessarily sound better. It's just, it was all those things that you were just talking about, that intangible magic that was just better somehow. They ended up wanting to use that. And I always thought that was interesting. Like thinking, the amount of money that was spent on recording the new version and, mix. It got to the point where, we mixed it and did all the things. It's just like, geez, all the tens of thousands of dollars that have gone into this. And it's like, well, let's use the demo.
Yeah, that's not actually all that unusual, especially
I don't think so.
From the old days. I'm not sure how much it happens these days, but people think, oh, it's only a demo. They're relaxed. They're willing to take some chances.
Totally.
Experiment. And then when the time comes to make the real version, it's like the pressure's on.
Yeah. Speaking to that, the question I have for you, I'm curious to hear your opinion about this, is, when I listen to, but, whatever. I mean, any music that was recorded in the 60s, like, there was this tune by the Kinks that came up recently for what I think I was doing something and someone referenced something from the Kinks, and I was listening to that, and the recording just compared to what we listen to now just sounds crazy. It's just like everything's kind of distorted, and like even the drums are kind of like just like everything's just overdriven, but there's this vibe that is just like amazing, and it sounds so exciting. I think that, if that music were to be recorded today, it wouldn't sound nearly as cool because it would be recorded a lot better, right? The gear is better. There's more thought put into, the actual recording of it. But from your perspective, but how much does that affect the listener? Were things better just back in the 60s, or are they better now?
I'd say in general, things are better now, but the limitations that we had in the 60s, and my real recording career didn't start till the end of the 60s, but you had a limited number of tape tracks. You had to deal with a lot of noise. You didn't have a lot of outboard gear that we have today. And those limitations sort of made you be more creative, I think. So I kind of miss that. I've even talked to some of my friends that I've recorded for 50 years or more now and said, and they brought this up too. It's like, why don't we do a session with just 4 tracks? We'll just pretend that, we only have 4 tracks to work with, and let's see what we can come up with. And actually haven't done that yet, although I do try to keep the track count to a minimum. Just in general, in that era of music, I think there was just a lot more innovation going on. And I've talked about this before on the podcast that I used to listen to WNEW-FM in New York, which was, years ahead of most commercial radio stations when it came to playing the newest music of that era. Every day you'd hear something that initially you said, "Ooh, that sounds so strange. I'm not sure I like that." But you kept being drawn back to it and saying, "I've got to figure this out. I don't understand this. I need to understand what they're doing here." I mean, not technically, but maybe some of that, but also musically. There's still some of that going on for sure. There's lots of creative people out there doing amazing things today. The whole atmosphere of the music world was so different because people weren't necessarily trying to do weird things, but they were just trying to do something that felt right to them. And there was just this explosion of creativity. Now, a lot of it was, not effective. We don't hear those songs anymore because they never went anywhere, except maybe a small cult following or something. But there's a lot of mainstream music. When it first came out, everybody said, even the Beatles, and they were very controversial.
Sure.
For a long time until, they suddenly, seemed to me, overnight became mainstream. Probably Ed Sullivan, made them acceptable to everybody. But they were doing things nobody else ever heard before. So it was a different world. So you had the limitations of the technology, which forced you into a different discipline of recording, simplified things. You didn't have an infinite capability of adding parts or whatever. It just wasn't there. Yeah, you had to decide what's important, what can we practically do here. And you could end up, with a 4-track recording with 90% of the instruments on one track.
Right.
Because there's no other choice.
Sure. Yeah, totally.
So you had to mix it, at the time. And
right. Yeah. You had to commit to decisions and just, make it work.
Right. So it was very, very different back then. Yeah. I like the the freedom that we have now, where it's never a question of, oh, gee, is this a really good use of our last track?
Yeah, right.
I'm glad to be free of those limitations and the limitations of tape, because as much as I love the sound of tape, it's a total pain to work with.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to look at it, because it's still it's sort of it's similar to how I feel about doing in-person sessions versus remote sessions. When you're in an in-person session, you have to commit to things and simplify things so that they are just working, so that like it's making everyone's life easier, which from a drumming perspective is usually a good thing. Editing, simplifying, all those things. Yeah, but I mean, I agree with you too. It's nice to not have those limitations. Like I said, to be here, have the flexibility of being here on my own and just kind of doing things how I want to do them is there's beauty in that too. But
yeah, I think that's everybody's dream.
Yeah. When I listen to the music that I love to listen to, which, is largely like, I mean, my favorite band is probably the Smiths. Music that was recorded, a lot of stuff from the 80s, that, I mean, sounds great and was recorded well and whatever, but it doesn't matter at all to me as a listener, even someone who, is aware of, the differences between a, poorly recorded something and a well recorded something. I don't care about any of that when I'm listening to music that I enjoy. It's just, is it good music or isn't it? Like my wife is always a great sounding board because she's not a musician at all, but is a music lover completely. I bounce stuff off her, that I think is sounding really great, but maybe because it's like something that I think sounds good for whatever reason, like it just is well recorded or whatever. And, she'll listen to it and be like, ugh, terrible. And it's because, and then I take a step back and it's like, oh yeah, well, yeah, I guess the music itself is pretty terrible, but it sounds great, doesn't it? And it's like, I don't know. It's like, I don't know what you're talking about, dude. That is not good music. I mean, it's someone like you with, who has such a kind of vast knowledge of, recording music and the different ways to record music and the different methods of recording music. And you've seen a lot of things change. Does fidelity matter? Is my question.
It's a really interesting question. And I think there's several aspects of that. Ultimately, it probably does not, because if you had a great song, I mean, it's always the song.
Right.
If you don't have the song, why bother with anything else? But
you mean the song and the drums is what you meant to say.
Well, yeah, of course, the drums.
Okay.
I used to have a saying when I had a commercial studio, and we had all kinds of, it wasn't all record company business. It wasn't all great artists and producers. It was a lot of people, that were singer-songwriters that wanted to record their stuff. And most of it was pretty forgettable, and some of it was pretty annoyingly bad. But I used to have a saying back then, and I think it still applies today, and that is, every song is somebody's favorite.
Mm.
And that may be an exaggeration, oversimplification, but the concept is that no matter what we think of the song, it may have some special meaning to somebody that, it only appeals to that person or a small group of people. But does that make it any less valid than the stuff that's, a monster hit that everybody loves?
Right.
I don't know that it does.
Right. Yeah.
So there's that aspect of it. And another part that I think is important is that when something is recorded well, even for somebody that has no appreciation or even the ability to express how they feel about the way the thing was recorded, it does affect them. They don't know it. They don't have the words to explain it. They just know that sounds really nice, or that sounds really powerful, or, whatever adjective they would apply to it.
Totally.
So there's that aspect of it. So I think it's always our obligation to provide the best possible recording. Now, that said, there's always things that go wrong in the studio just because suddenly somebody decided, to crank their guitar up after you had all the levels set and things like that. Sometimes that's just like, oh, man, we can't use that. But other times it's like, yeah, that's not great, but the part, he played it really well,
Right. Totally.
And I'm not getting rid of that because he may never do that again. We might try to get that again, but we may not. So there's that aspect of it. And then yet another aspect is that for the people working on the music, everybody in the control room, everybody in the studio, when it sounds better to them, they're more enthusiastic about making the music. So I think it's really important for the performers to hear stuff that sounds really good. And once again, that's not to overshadow the performance or the song, but when you have those pieces in place, then a great sounding recording will, raise the enthusiasm level for everybody in the project.
Yeah, that's a cool point. I mean, yeah, it's like, and the thing, like I always notice if I'm in some, badass studio and, someone's referencing some song that like maybe I've never heard and they put it on the awesome sounding speakers and it's like, and I get like blasted in the face with just like, oh my God, this is the most amazing thing I've ever heard. And then, after the session, I get in the car and I put on that same song, like, oh, I want to really check out that thing. It sounded so amazing. And I listen to it in the car and it's like, I mean, this is okay, but it's nothing. but the difference is, in the quality of sound. And there's, if it's sounding really incredible, there's something to that. But, when listening to something you recorded in the way that like we record our music and what that does to your brain, it is a very different thing. That, that is, you listen to it and it feels good. And like you said, it's not really tangible what the difference is, but it's the difference between it just making you feel good and not. The thing is that I feel like most people that listen to music now definitely are not sitting in their living room on some hi-fi system listening to music. I think that's few and far between. I think most people, even someone like me who's, a lover of music and someone who works in the music business, I listen to music like in the car, streaming off of Spotify, Bluetooth, to the car stereo. It's like so many layers of just awfulness between me and the music. But that's how I experience music. That's not obviously, if I'm really scrutinizing something, I'll put it on at the studio and then I realize like, oh, wow, either, oh, this sounds amazing or, oh, this doesn't sound as amazing as I thought it did. It's interesting to think about how all of this affects the end listener.
My guest has been studio drummer John O'Reilly. For more information on John's drum overdub service, visit his website, boomcrashdrumtracks.com. It's all one word. Thanks for listening, and please tell others about this podcast if you think they would find it useful. You can subscribe at any of the over 30 podcast providers who carry my take on music recording, including Apple Podcasts. Your comments and suggestions are always welcome. Send me email at dwfern@dwfern.com. This is my take on music recording. I'm Doug Fern. See you next time.